This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. A quick reminder before I dive into my guest today. If you've not yet seen my newest edition of Trend Following, and this came out within the last year, pick it up. Now, there's 3 versions. There's the hardcover, of course, the Kindle, of course, the audiobook, of course. The Kindle is the least exciting one, in my opinion, because the hardcover is like something you could kill somebody with. It's this beast of a book. Okay, it goes without saying, the content has gone through my filter and the content is great. But the hardcover of my newest edition of Trend Following, this is a dark blue cover, no image on the front. This sucker is a beast. Please check it out. You will absolutely guaranteed, if you're interested in the markets, trading, perhaps making more than $1. The audiobook for my newest edition of Trend Following, 30 plus hours. Let me repeat, 30 plus hours. I'm going to keep you busy. As you might know, I like to be diverse on this podcast show. I like to bring in very unique guests. My guest today is Shane Snow. He's an award-winning journalist, entrepreneur, best-selling author of Smartcuts. His newest book is Dream Teams. For any of us that have to pull together the efforts of more than one person, which generally means all of us, if we are doing anything in this life. I mean, if we're bums, if we're just going through life working for the man and never thinking about ever collaborating with anybody, I guess bum is too strong of a word, but you kind of get my point. Look, I'm a nice guy, but I really implore people to take a damn chance, to go down that path, to create something. And generally, when you do try to create something in the modern world, collaboration is key. A team is key. But how does that team best come together? Does that team best come together with perhaps 6 alphas of the same IQ and the same competitive spirit, and somehow or another, these exact similar individuals with the same skill sets will all produce the next great piece of art? Or is it a little more complicated? My guest today, Shane Snow, has gone down this path with some fantastic examples, ranging from the Red Army hockey team. Think back to the Miracle on Ice, where the USA won. But that Red Army hockey team, there were some real lessons there, all the way to the Tang Clan, the hip-hop group, this very diverse hip-hop group of 9 individuals. I don't care what the hell you do in your life. These kinds of insights cause you to pause. Just sit down and say, hold on, that's useful. I'm not going to make that mistake again. If there's anything I try to do in this podcast, bring on the guests that tell us, here, I've gone down the path, I've figured this out, don't make the same damn mistake again. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Shane Snow. So Shane, before I dive into Dream Teams today, I want some genesis. I want to know the trigger, the exact trigger, not the political correct trigger or the PR trigger. I want to know what was the button that had to be pushed for you to go down this interesting path of teams. Before we even get into the content of the book, before we go, and I've got a lot of places I'm going to take you in your content, what was the trigger for you?
The main thing that really triggered this is I started a company about 7.5 years ago, not really intending to. My background was in science and then journalism, and then ended up starting this tech company that's kind of in the journalism space. I started this company with a couple of friends, and the first couple of years, it was kind of just us and a couple of people we hired. But then after we started to become successful, my job went from doing things and making things to making sure that other people could do and make things. And there's kind of this peculiar thing that I found, which was that the more we had these kind of healthy debates and arguments and fights, the smarter ideas we came up with. And this was something that my partners had. We had this great sort of debate dynamic where kind of no ego between us. And for whatever reason, we just had these very different perspectives on things. And as I saw, as our team got bigger and bigger, and suddenly there were 50 people, that kind of dynamic was really hard to achieve. In the same way, my job kind of went from making things to making sure people didn't kind of murder each other, but also, to sort of team builder and kind of team shepherd, I guess. And so I was curious how that kind of thing worked, I guess. What's the dynamic between groups that manage to be more than the sum of their parts and groups that don't, because it sure felt like we were going to fall apart all the time.
You have an example, one that I think many Americans of a certain age will relate to. Even though I was a young guy, I remember watching it live, and I was not a hockey fan, never played hockey, but the Miracle on Ice, the 1980 Olympics, the Americans beating the Russians. And it was a big deal. It was like the Americans really didn't know much about the Russians at that time. It was Cold War. Everyone just knew the Russians always won in hockey. And basically, they had a professional team. They had a professional team ranging from, the age of our guys, 21 approximately, all the way up until mid-30s or so. So we pretty much knew it was a professional Red Army Soviet team. And we were basically putting a bunch of college guys out there that had been kind of grouped together really quickly against a team that just beat everybody upside and downside for decades. Obviously, the Americans won, and that was, kind of a rare thing. And it was a big deal, and it's made for great movies and all that kind of stuff. But I think the real story and where you go is the dominance of that Soviet-era team and why they had so much dominance. Because, and I'll add one more point before I let you jump in on this. And you point this out. I was not aware of this, but, once the wall came down, well, a lot of these former Soviet players went to the NHL. These guys that were on the Red Army team that beat everybody upside and downside, assumingly all-stars, went to various, NHL teams and did not succeed. So it's a really interesting story when you look at it that way. And this is where I'm going to start you with, is let's break apart what we can all learn about the team building of the Soviet-era hockey team that was invincible, except for, frankly, one error against us.
I love the Miracle on Ice story because we have, it actually is a great illustration of just perspective. We have this narrative and this perspective in the United States that this was, and you look at the news kind of headlines and the interviews that they gave, and they say the same thing, that this was an example of our way being better than their way. And I think that that's just one of those things that when you really zoom out, it's kind of ridiculous to say our way of life as free democracy, capitalism is just so much better than the evil communism. It's so interesting that hockey game, in those days during the Miracle on Ice, it was this proxy war for these sort of different ideas.
Their hockey way was far superior than our hockey way.
Yeah. Right. It's funny because their hockey way is actually very much communist hockey, but it's not about communism versus capitalism thing when it's a team sport. And this is actually what gets really interesting. I was interested in exactly what you were saying. These great players, these were amazing players. They'd score 70 points a season, and each. And they just destroyed everyone for years and years. In the Olympics, they were playing against, for kind of loophole reasons, they were playing against a lot of amateurs. But in regular international competitions, they'd go to Canada for these big international games. And Wayne Gretzky would say, like, they just picked me apart. I don't know what happened. And so they were all pretty amazing players. But then when they went and they joined the NHL, like you said, they kind of sucked. They were not that great. They were fine. They weren't the best. There were other Canadian hockey players and American hockey players that were, amazing. Wayne Gretzky was, the best at the time. And yet when they were together, these Soviet hockey players were just unstoppable. And so it kind of, that itself says something about kind of the way that we think about teamwork. Great teams, and over you see this in history, they're not just the combination of the best people. There's actually something more, something deeper. It's about the dynamic between people with this example of this hockey team. Part of what, there's a whole bunch in there, but part of what they did is they played hockey differently, but they were really what they called servants to the puck. So for them, the team and the game was all about basically getting that goal, and they did not care about their individual stats, which is a very different style of playing, especially at the time, than the Canadian and American hockey teams. They had a few things going for them. They played together for a long time, which was not terribly unique. So did a lot of, Canadian kids growing up playing together for, years and years and years. They had this sort of, we're going to share, and it doesn't matter what happens to me so long as the puck gets in the net. There are all these examples of these times when these players, like this one guy who's my favorite, who was the team captain for many years, he was not the best of all the players on the team. So he'd kind of human kamikaze. He'd be like, you know what? Okay, I'm going to get injured in order to take this guy out. He actually got in a fight with the coach one time to kind of like defend his fellow players about something. He actually choked the coach. And these guys would do anything for each other, but anything so that puck could get in the net. That same guy, he's my favorite. He had a heart attack on the rink one time and he kept playing. So there's sort of these incredible stories of what these guys would do. But then when they went to the NHL, they suddenly, that style of passing the puck a million times and no one's out for their own point score, that didn't work very well because these American and Canadian players is very much this sort of brutal, football style, like knock people over and, rack up the points and get the puck to Wayne Gretzky. And it just, those two styles did not mesh very well. But the thing that, about the story that's kind of the most awesome is a lot of these players are kind of washed up after a few years in the NHL. They're in their 30s. This guy Fetisov, who was sort of the best player on the Soviet team, like 50 points a season to 2 points a season. And then the coach of the Detroit Red Wings actually slowly started gathering up these guys. And he ended up with 5 of them, with a starting lineup of 5 of these Soviet players. And he basically said to them, he's like, look, I'm not going to give you a playbook. Just play how you guys want to play. And so these Soviet players basically used their own playbook that they learned for decades training with, these 2 crazy coaches, basically. And they took kind of their style and they said it was like fish being back in water again. And they destroyed everyone. These 5 players that they've, finally got back together in Detroit, and they won more games than anyone that season. They won the Stanley Cup 2 years in a row. And then finally, this guy Fetisov, who's in his late 30s, he retired and he became like the head of sports in Russia. But everyone sort of scratched their heads. They're like, these washed-up players that used to be amazing, that now suck, are back together again, and no one can stop them. So there must be something about the way that they play. And there's much more than just this sort of share the puck, put the team first. But that is kind of the starting point, I think. When we think about great teams, a lot of times our narrative is, just get Shaq and Kobe and whoever else, the greatest at every position on the team, and it'll be fine. Actually, that doesn't add up to the best teams in history. In sports, you see this over and over again in great sports dynasties, that it's more than just, the individuals adding up. But you also see this in business. You see this in any kind of team in history. And that was sort of the thing that got me going on kind of the narrative adventure in dream teams throughout history, is looking at kind of the best teams in history in different categories and, what elements they share. But it does kind of start with that there's this paradox that it's not the individuals adding up that make for the great teams.
It's really interesting. You said at the top there, I think you said the way you phrased it, communist hockey. It's kind of taking the political nature of communism, applying it to hockey. And you have to really think at that point in time when you have so many young guys. Okay, they're not in America, so they don't have this option to go build a company or do this or do that. The economy is not that great, but still with national pride and still being competitive individuals, they're given the opportunity to participate on the national team. It seems like, whether it was just fortuitous, a little bit of luck, but having that communist ideal surely played a huge role in the teamwork that ultimately led to an NHL coach saying, I really don't know what you guys do, just go do it. And all of a sudden he won a couple extra Stanley Cups. Really fascinating, huh?
I think that there's pros and cons to kind of the individualist mentality that we sort of have in our culture in the West, but certainly in team sports, and certainly if you're talking about a team being a unit, that's bigger and more important than the individual, there's principles of communism that really make sense. Again, back to sports, if I guess the individual can be at odds with the group, and the goals of the individual can be at odds with the goals of the group, and that can be okay unless whatever the group is trying to accomplish is more important. The actual dream team in men's basketball was that classic Olympic team with Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson and all of them in the early 90s. That was the first time, I guess, in the West we use the term dream team. There's also a soccer team in Barcelona and stuff. But in that dream team, it's interesting what happened is you had suddenly, pro players could play basketball in the Olympics. And everyone was excited. And of course, the U.S. was going to win. But at first, when they started practicing, you had all these all-stars. It was not a great show. They were not doing well. And it was because there was too much individualism on that team. And it actually was, this is an oversimplification, but it basically was when Magic Johnson, who was full of ego and such a huge star, when he finally said, you know what, I can't be the alpha at the same time as this kid, Michael Jordan. And I think that I need to defer a little bit and try to, my role on this team is to make sure that the ball is, near his hands when he's jumping towards the basket. My role on this team is no longer to make the most points. And that was when things changed, and that team, destroyed everyone in basketball like everyone knew they would. But it was not going very well at first when they were both trying to be the star. And those are the kinds of decisions that make the difference between a team that has all the potential in the world and a team that actually fulfills that potential.
Well, I don't know if you're an NBA guy, but there's a couple good teams in the NBA right now. And from Golden State, they have a guy named Draymond Green, and the Celtics have a guy named Marcus Smart. Both of these guys don't look that great on paper, but they do something on the court that makes the team better. I mean, Smart hardly can shoot the ball, but the damn team, when he's on the floor, just excels. And so I think you could find this. I mean, I think back to a guy like Dennis Rodman, and you can see this across all sports. You can find in baseball a guy that perhaps was not the best player, but he brought some kind of energy, maybe perhaps like the old Soviet player, the team captain that kind of rallied everybody. There's sometimes these things that you can't put on paper or you can't moneyball it actually do count.
Well, I had a few really great conversations while I was writing this book with a basketball player named Shane Battier. And I love this guy because his first email to me was like, "Hi, Shane, it's Shane. Let's please co-write your next book called It's Shane People, not Sean. Get it right." Anyways, he's hilarious. But Shane Battier is known as the no stats all-star. And he was this guy that he never scored points in the NBA. I mean, he was a great player. He made it to the NBA. But somehow every time he played, his team did better. And, he got more championships than you would expect for someone with his stats. And he now runs analytics for the Miami Heat. And we talked at length about how what he looks for and what a lot of teams in the NBA look for now are attributes that beyond just, how many points can you score, how many out of 20 free throws can you hit? And a lot of it actually ends up being screening for things like selflessness and open-mindedness, adaptability and flexibility, being able to change your game, your style quickly, things like that are a lot harder to quantify, but are very interesting. And so there's this concept in the NBA that I think actually could be applied to business or to anything else. And I get at it a bit in the book, but not under this name. And I'm planning to write more about it. But there's this concept called plus minus. That's basically, when Shane is on the team, how many more points compared to the other team does the team make versus when Shane's not on the team? And Shane Snow on an NBA team would be minus 1 billion points. You put me on the floor and we're going to not score as much. But you put Shane Battier on the team and they're going to score 10 more points per game on average than they would otherwise, even if those points aren't scored by him. And I think that this is something that if you're building a team of any sort, that plus minus factor, it's not just, we're building a website, so we need a designer, we need a programmer, and, we need a copywriter. It's maybe not the best example, but, we need these 3 roles. Let's get the best one of each of those. If you're going to be building a lot of websites and you're going to be solving hard problems together, 3 people to actually contribute more than just that skill. Is this programmer going to be, more of a plus to this team in general than just their programming skills? I don't know. That's a weird analogy I've never used, but the idea of plus minus I think is very interesting.
I think that was the stat that I did not know the name for, Marcus Smart with the Celtics. I think that's exactly what his situation is. When he's out there, the plus just goes through the roof, even if he's shooting 20% from the floor. Let's start to tear this apart, though, because we talked about the Soviet team, the old Soviet team, and the team being so exceptional together. We didn't necessarily talk about the parts. Now, these were not all, exactly perfect, replicas of each other. I mean, these were very different parts that made up this team. I can't go through the description that you give in the book, but you kind of describe the players and, we're all the same. And that's something and you mentioned with your firm and having that kind of, that tension, that debate, and then ending up with something better. Let's break this apart in terms of the modern team, and we'll go into some other examples. It starts with diversification. And one of the things that I really love about what you've done with your work here is that in an age where it seems like on every major media channel, I don't care what your partisan stripe is, it seems like diversification is defined as what's your race? What's your gender? Whereas ultimately, we all know deep down, it's insane to try and say, well, gosh, all women are the same, or all men are the same, or all black guys are the same, or all white guys are the same, or all gay guys are the same. No, what we're really looking for is that cognitive diversity. And somewhere we've really gotten lost that that's what we're after. And this superficial stuff, and I know, look, it's important, as you describe it, external and internal attributes. But ultimately, at the end of the day, those things are not going to allow that team to, that's not going to be the dividing line. It's going to ultimately be that cognitive diversity, isn't it?
Yeah, so the tricky thing about this issue, and the reason why we reduce things to things that we can see, like race and gender, the tricky thing is because there has been historically so much injustice across those lines, especially, if we're talking kind of U.S.-centric. We have hundreds of years of history of treating people badly because of their race and gender. It still is a problem in a lot of, of business today, and culture. That's part of what the trouble is. But if you look at the dynamics of a group of people that are able to solve problems better than just an individual, it's been pretty clearly proven by, mathematicians and professors of complex systems and social scientists that if you want a group to be smarter than just its smartest member, then you need different ways of thinking to collide. And that's what cognitive diversity is. So, if we have a group of people and I'm the smartest person and no one challenges me or, we don't do anything, everyone thinks the same as me, but I'm just the smartest, then we're going to go with my ideas. But if you and I think very differently on some issue, we have different perspective, different experiences that add up to us looking at this problem differently, it doesn't matter who's the smartest, we can potentially come up with something better together. And I go through kind of in detail how this works in the book. But when we talk about diversity, especially in America, we think of it as synonymous with external factors, with race and gender, in particular, sexual orientation sometimes. Those things actually can reveal or be proxies for cognitive diversity. And actually, they're pretty reliable. But there's a lot more that goes into that equation. Cognitive diversity is how you see the world. It's the prism through which you view different problems or situations. That perspective is shaped by who you are and how you grow up and how people look at you when you walk into a room, and all of the little experiences that you have over your life add up to something. But you and I could look completely different and grow up in the same house and go to the same schools and have the same career. And we might actually approach most problems in a given situation pretty similarly. We might not approach some problems because we look different. People look at us different and through our whole lives. And there are some situations in which, it would be useful to have both of us on the team. But chances are, if it's an academic problem, we went to the same school and studied the same way and think the same way, then you may as well let one of us do something else and put one of us on the team and find someone else. So this is something that, I looked at as kind of the foundational argument after this idea that teams are not what they seem, is that a lot of work that we do, we presume the easy way to work together is kind of to build an army of people on an assembly line that, one person has already done the thinking, and so everyone just kind of do the job that you've been told. That's fine unless you're solving a new problem or a hard problem, or you want to be innovative, unless you want to do better than before, which frankly, most of the work that we're doing in the world right now, we need to be better than before. If you want an army of hammer swingers breaking rocks, sure, make them all the same. But if you want to invent a new way to break rocks, or you want to do something, much more important than that, then you're shooting yourself in the foot if you think that stacking your team with people who get along really well and who are great culture fits and are so happy to be working together, that is going to get you a better outcome than stacking the team with people who are really going to butt heads on the way that they approach the problem. Now, of course, the opposite side of that is you have a team that thinks very differently. You have a group of people colliding that have different ways of looking at things. You're going to potentially go too far and spend too much time destroying each other than you do, working on the problem. This happens. This is why actually a lot of times we're afraid to go too far into building diverse teams, because people who are different, who think different, are a threat to kind of the peace and stability of our thing that we have going. But you look at that Soviet hockey team, and they all grew up in Russia. They all are, it's all men, or boys really, for many years. They all kind of look similar, right? They're all Russian, but under the surface, and this is why I like to start the book with this example, because there's plenty of examples where race and gender are incredibly important factors. But again, like you say, they're not. Just because you are one race or one gender doesn't mean you think the same as everyone else in that category, in that group. But these hockey players, there's the one who was kind of the stocky steam engine type that was, would just like sort of bear down and knock people over. And there's the one who is more of sort of the dancer that would skate around. And there were, there was the funny one who would kind of cheer everyone up and make the mood lighter. And there was the one that would kind of mad dog the other players. And, they had this great dynamic. And there were a whole bunch of players. They couldn't all just swap out players that were all the same. And actually what happened in The Miracle on Ice that I think is so fascinating is that was the one time, this incredible hockey team like really lost in an important match, and they were so furious. And what happened was, in this game, and I don't know if you remember much of the movie, but there were a couple of crucial points where the Russian coach did some things, and he basically pulled out some of these players from this Red Army team, and he swapped in players from the KGB army as kind of a political move to score points with the Kremlin, because they for sure thought they were going to win. So he put in these other players that were kind of the soldier players that were, kind of played the same. They were the ones that were trained to be, just one kind of monolithic unit. Whereas these other players, this Red Army team that was so great, it was because they were sort of this ragtag group of misfits that had been playing together for so long that got it, that made them so great. And yeah, so they put in these other players that were just sort of more straight up traditional, do things by the book in the same way. And then they lost, by the skin of their teeth. They almost won anyway. But that's why it was such a miracle that they lost. But it's kind of they were their own undoing when they changed up the team
While we're talking about the Soviet team, and we were in the middle of cognitive diversity, and that makes a lot of sense. And people are going to need to go read and really go through the detail of how you've laid it all out. But it makes a lot of sense that you can get smart people, diverse thinking, and you bring them into the room together, and a lot of really good stuff can happen. And you have this great example in the book, and I would love for you to kind of explain it in short. Daimlerchrysler. So this would be basically Mercedes and the K car connecting, colliding, saying, hey, let's do a big merger. This is going to be great for everyone. Let's take the greatest German luxury maker and let's combine it with a U.S. company that makes something called the K car. I guess they thought it all looked good on paper, and this would have been cognitive diversity. I mean, look, I'm making fun of Chrysler, but they were a successful company for a long period of time. It didn't exactly work out. Why don't you tell that story?
Yeah. So what I was looking at is why do most business mergers fail? And by proxy, why do so many partnerships fail? And, what is it that's a leading indicator that a marriage is going to fail? When we have kind of the other side of dream teams is teams that should have worked out, that on paper look great and don't. It turns out that actually most of the time when you're talking about corporate mergers and actually diversity inside of corporations, most of the time it does not work out, which is one of these great paradoxes. And Daimler-Chrysler is such a great example because it's so dramatic. So yeah, here are these two companies. This one known for great innovation, but not so great margins, and this other company known for this sort of can-do, we can make anything, sort of beloved in the hometown and great margins. And then they said, on paper, this looks great. If we merge, we can now compete with Ford, and we're worried about all the Japanese car makers that are starting to get big. We can maybe, really do this thing and become number one if we combine these things, this sort of grit and scrappiness with this innovation. So they merged the companies. It was the biggest merger of all time. And they said it was a merger of equals, a merger of unprecedented strength. And then, it was, only a few years later that the company broke apart and Chrysler was then sold for, a fraction of what it had been worth before. And actually at its highest point, the new company did not add up to be worth more than the old two companies combined, or was something close to what one of them was before, which is crazy. And what happened is pretty interesting because they had read all the business literature about how, mergers fail because of differences, because of culture. That's the cliche, a merger doesn't fail or partnership doesn't fail because the cultural fit doesn't happen. The integration doesn't happen. And so they did all these things where they had all these trainings and programs, on German, dining etiquette and American, business best practices and traditions. And, they had this German workforce of engineers and business people, and this American Detroit-based primarily workforce of engineers and business people who had very different approaches and very different ways of thinking about cars. What was important in the process, what was important to the buyers. You would think that they come together and the combination of those ways of thinking, they could make a better car company. But instead they didn't. And they spent all this time on this cultural integration stuff. And to what end? Not really anything. And then it became this big disaster. And after a few years, everyone had left and gone to Ford. And, the CEO of Daimler said, what happened to this great sort of cowboy can-do culture that I thought I'd merged with? Where is this? It feels like we can't do anything now. And what happened when you look under the surface is actually not that you would expect, okay, they're very different companies. Maybe they don't respect each other that much. Some of, the executives kind of talk trash on the other cars. They said, I'd never drive a Chrysler, or I'd never drive, whatever. But really what happened is actually the opposite. They didn't fight at all. In fact, they hardly communicated. They were so worried about stepping on each other's toes that they kept things pretty buttoned up and separate. So the CEOs of the two companies actually hardly talked, which is not a good sign. But they didn't bring all the Germans over to to go live in Detroit, and kind of work in the Chrysler factories because they didn't want to ruffle too many feathers. And they didn't do the same with, the Detroit people. They didn't bring them over to Germany. And they actually kind of kept them running as separate lines of business, hoping that there would be some cross-contamination that would make things better, hoping that they would learn from each other. But instead, they kind of devolved into what's called organizational silence, where inside of both companies, people were kind of scared of this, cultural conflict. And they just sort of clammed up, even amongst each other. It became this environment where people were kind of nervous to speak up, and they were nervous about what would happen if they said anything against the grain. And it turned out that anything could kind of be against the grain because now they had this mix of people. So it became this sort of disaster. And eventually they said, you know what, we're better off just splitting up and just being on our own. And this is actually what you see happen a lot in kind of corporate diversity initiatives where, on a much smaller level than two giant companies merging, so you have a team where you're like, hey, we need to inject some diversity. If they're thinking about it right, we need to inject some diverse thinking. You hire, people from different backgrounds, maybe people who do look differently, or you're building a new team. You combine two teams at a smaller level, and it turns out that rarely happens. It does happen, and it can be a problem where your job becomes to undermine the other people because you hate them so much. This happens a lot in politics, in fact. But usually, what happens is the people who get brought in because of their cognitive diversity, they slowly get quiet. When I was doing interviews for the book about, she's the head of diversity and inclusion. She said, it's such a shame. We hire all these kids. We have a largely white and male workforce. So in our diversity program, we try to hire kids from different races and backgrounds. And so we hire all these kids from the Caribbean and Native American kids and Black kids and Latinos, and we bring them in and they come from all sorts of different colleges. And and I think they were thinking about it in kind of a better way than a lot of places. They have this diverse range of experiences, and then we tell them to get with the program, to work and think like we do. And you watch them slowly, after not even a year or two, start to just shut up. They are included in the meeting, but they're not adding anything because they don't feel like what they're going to bring that's different is going to be accepted. So they only add things that are kind of the things that they know are not going to ruffle the feathers. And it's like we just train people to do that. And that's what happened with Daimlerchrysler, is people were so worried about the conflict that they devolved into silence. And, when you hear about the two leaders of a newly merged company spending weeks without talking to each other, of course that company is going to fall apart.
You've got this great point as you talk about the diversity and bringing the young kids in from all around, and they feel like they won't be listened to. You've got this point that you make in your book, and it actually resonates with me because it sounds so much like a trading strategy that I write about. And you talk about, to maximize the chance of progress, don't ignore a perspective. Because no matter how weird something might sound, that could be the big one. That could be the breakthrough. That could be the one that just pushes the company to greater heights. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, but there's a story from Jeff Bezos and Amazon where he has, I don't know how he does this exactly. I don't remember all the details, but essentially if certain groups want to start a new project, Bezos doesn't get the chance to override them at the beginning. It gets funded. They get to move it down the path because he's bright enough to know that he doesn't know. So he's kind of like giving people the chance to just take these chances because he doesn't know which one's going to win. And he's bright enough to know that we're going to have a lot of small losses, so to speak. But going through that process of small losses, and small losses could be the wide different perspective in the room. Not all that perspective is going to shine through and be a winner, but there's going to be some that are. And that's a very different way of thinking.
The classic quote that's attributed to Einstein that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting things to change. The side note, the thing I love about that quote is it actually doesn't come from Einstein. It's one of those that gets attributed to everyone. It actually comes from Alcoholics Anonymous in the 80s, which I think is really apropos. But, the thing about that quote that's interesting is it's sort of the foil to being scared of insane ideas. A lot of times things that we think are crazy are the things that we shut out. But it turns out what's actually crazy is to shut them out, is to just do the same thing over and over again. I mean, I like the point that you're making. And this actually is the thing that connects this book to my first book that I wrote in 2014, which is called Smartcuts, which is about this idea of lateral thinking, that innovation happens not when people play the same game, but when they play a different game, when they change the game. The guy that jumped over the high jump bar backwards, that everyone was like, oh, you're going to break your neck. How could you do this? Then it turns out that's just a better way to jump over the high jump bar. So that idea that a new perspective, a new angle on a problem is the only way to make a breakthrough, rather than the same angle just working a little harder. You make incremental change, but you make breakthrough change by looking at new angles. And this is the other thing that leads to dream teams, which is a lot of times what the team's missing is that new person to show them that new angle. And sometimes what helps the team make that new perspective is actually the combination of those perspectives add up to a new perspective. But yeah, it's so ironic, I guess, just the way that we treat this in our work. There were two studies that I found in the same month or week or something that I can't remember if I included them in the book, if they're just in a footnote. But they did this study on what attributes make someone more likely to be promoted to leadership and less likely to be promoted to leadership in American business. And I'm sure this is true throughout the world, because American business is a little, actually, I think, less conservative in nature in terms of the ideas that they'll let people take risks on. But basically, the summary of this study that these social scientists did was that the more creative people think you are, the less likely you are to be promoted to leader. So it's a lot less likely to make it to CEO, being promoted through the ranks, if you're seen as a creative person. And the conclusion is that it's because creativity is kind of risky, that new ideas, different ideas, they're not familiar. We don't know if they're proven. And so it could be risky to the outcomes. And then the other study that I found at the same time was they did, I think it was Deloitte, as one of those consulting companies, did a big survey of CEOs, and where they asked the CEOs, what are the attributes of the next generation of CEOs that are going to be the most important? And number one was creativity. The leaders of these, of organizations are saying that we need people at the helm who can think differently, who can be open to new ideas and perspectives and ways of doing things. And yet our culture in business prevents us from putting those kinds of people in leadership because we're afraid of that thing that is weird, because crazy so often, or good ideas so often look crazy, or different ideas so often look crazy.
I've got a line from you here that I love. Things that keep us stuck on the mountain peak are our expert perspectives and heuristics that got us there in the first place.
Yeah. Success actually has this sort of pernicious quality to it, in that we think that what got us to this point and made us successful, is the thing that we should lean into further. I use this analogy of the mountain range, that if you're trying to find the tallest peak on a mountain and say the mountain's covered in fog, so you're kind of feeling your way through it, once you get to a peak that seems good, it's kind of hard to get off that and to walk down so that you can explore and see if there's something better. That, a lot of times that's the paradox that we have in our teams, is we're like, hey, this is working and we've been successful with this, and we're the best, until someone else comes along and they find a better, taller mountain peak and we're no longer the best. And it's so hard, because to find that next peak, we have to go down into the trough. You got to go through some pain. And this is actually, I think, one of the points that I think is the most important about my exploration of dream teams, is most of the time it's harder than we think. That it's not, and that's why the kind of the myth that you just hire the best people and that's it is such a myth.
One of the things that I really love about the book is the storytelling. And as a guy who has written some books, I can really appreciate the craft. Now, I would love to sit here and pick your mind on the various stories, because there's a lot of them. And in particular, I think a lot of people will really enjoy reading what you've put together about the Tang Clan, which was a really fascinating take on team building and how that all came together and became so damn successful. But I would love for you, in the little bit of time we have left, to tell me, because I'm really curious, and this is kind of a side question, how did you assemble this? Because, for anyone that's done any writing at all, there's a real craft here, because you're flowing a lot of different topics, a lot of different stories, and you're flowing them together in a really cool way. So I had myself sitting there thinking, how did he storyboard this? I mean, I know you must have storyboarded it, but I mean, there was a lot of, it wasn't just sit down and write a straight line. I mean, there's a little bit of a, not exactly, because he'll go back and forth in time, but there's a little bit of a Tarantino type weaving things together in an unexpected way, and it kind of just all flows. How is this constructed? I'm really curious.
First of all, that's the greatest compliment I could get as a writer. I really like the cinematic approach to storytelling in books and in writing. I figure for me, if I'm going to be working on something for years, I want to be entertained by it. So that's part of my selfish motivation for the stories. The process, it starts with digging in to understand the principles, the science and the research underneath all of these things. And some of that starts with stories. I learn about the Soviet hockey team, and then I'm curious about their dynamics. So I dig into it, and I read everything about them and interview some people to try and get at those principles. But a lot of it starts with figuring out what are the underlying concepts and spending a lot of time talking to researchers and interviewing people. And then there's kind of this, it sort of happens both ways, where I then look for, what's the funnest, most entertaining, or perhaps most compelling example of this that I could find that's a vehicle for this principle. And then I'd go and try and interview those people. And, my outlining and storyboarding process took way longer than my writing process, because I went down so many different kind of avenues. And, it's kind of it starts in a text document, and then it goes to sticky notes on every window of every surface. Every hotel I went to, all the surfaces were covered in sticky notes, and then I'm kind of redoing and reorganizing those, kind of chipping away at the concepts, and then that goes back into a text document. I print it out and reshuffle the papers. So it's kind of this sort of mad thing that I don't know is the greatest process, but trying to kind of squeeze out, trying to distill what really is afoot in the underlying principles first, and then find the ways. The Wu-Tang Clan, I started with the history of hip hop. So I thought that hip hop was a great example of, that chapter is about cognitive friction, and in this, kind of zone of possibility where kind of the magic happens inside of teams. And so originally I was looking at the history of hip hop. And I don't know how I got onto that. I knew very little about hip hop, and that's maybe part of what helped me is I think, exploring stories that I know nothing about and just being super curious allows me to pick up details that I think people that are very familiar with the material might not, because they already know the ending of the story. But I was looking at the history of hip hop and how they started with these DJ battles, where they have two DJs on opposite sides of a gymnasium. And the battle literally was whose music is the best. So the party dances on one side or the other, and how that kind of turned into eventually, the MCs battling, and rhyming at each other. And that turned into hip hop.
The competition,
exactly. So I love that story. And I was digging into that. I was interviewing hip hop experts, wishing that I didn't live in Idaho in the 80s and 90s. So that I could have, seen. I'd have loved to be in the Bronx, in the 80s, when a lot of this was happening. And then I basically was like, well, what's a hip hop group that maybe is a good example of this themselves? How do I zoom in even further on hip hop? And it just turns out that inevitably you end up with the Wu-Tang Clan when you try and dig into that story, because they were built. It was these 9 guys, which is an insane amount of people to collaborate on, an album. But these 9 guys who came from rival gangs, who were very suspicious of each other, somehow managed to be what many call the most influential hip hop group of all time. So, start there with that story, the most influential hip hop group, and do they actually represent this same dynamic of the battle, and it turns out they do perfectly. That was how the RZA, who was kind of the main guy that put them together, his whole thing was, you show up with your lyrics to the recording studio, and I'm going to make two of you fight for this beat that I just made. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of exploring, and I explored other rap groups too, but kind of inevitably landed on them. But there's a lot of stories in the book that I also wanted to have a diverse set of stories, because I wanted to speak to a lot of different kinds of people. And I think that it's helpful if you're trying to look at this as a way to, how to work better with teams or be inspired by other people in my own work in, say in trading. I don't want all the stories to be about trading, because those will be you'll get less of a diversity of perspective there. So I did kind of make some decisions, in certain chapters there maybe was a better story on the face of it, but I already have, too many music stories or too many sports stories. And so let's do a story about mental health or, investigative journalism or something like that. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer to your question, but it was a lot longer of a process than just gathering up my favorite stories.
What was your start to finish in terms of time? I'm just curious.
Thinking about it, this idea had been kind of itching at me for years, and I'd written a little things here or there for blog posts, starting in maybe 2012, 2013. And then actually what I did is I've been doing the researching and outlining and, sticky notes on windows and walls, and lots of long conversations with people late at night in bars, bouncing ideas off them and getting their take. A lot of that for a couple of years. And then I took 2 months sabbatical from work, and I went mostly to South America, but I kind of went around a bunch of different places. I ended up in Russia and back. But I took 2 months where I just wrote for 12 hours a day. And for me, for my personality, it was kind of perfect. I knew exactly what I wanted to say at that point. I just had to write it down. So it's just kind of this mad drink the caffeine and just sit in some weird place where I know no one, and so no one's going to bother me, and just wrote. And then after that, I came back, and it was 9 months of editing and self-doubt and, wondering why anyone will care. The writing part itself, which to me is a lot of the fun, actually was the least amount of time, and sort of speaks to, one of my favorite editors when I was writing for Wired magazine a lot. He kind of gave me this advice that the best pieces, the best stories, at most a third of the time is spent on the writing. And, a third of the time is spent on the thinking, a third of the time is spent on the reporting and research, and then a third is spent on the writing at most. And a lot of times it's less. And so that was kind of my process. Another, I don't know if you're a Michael Lewis fan. Apparently his process is that he does all of the research and all the reporting and goes over his notes so much that by the time he sits down to write, he doesn't need to refer to his notes because he's basically got it. And then it's just about, his brain outputting to his fingers. And I really love that idea. So my process is a little bit like that. I, one day would aspire to do the kind of work that he does. But yeah, that's kind of how it happened.
It's interesting too. We talk about the Daimler-Chrysler merger and how it really didn't go right. And we bring up something like hip hop and how that kind of started as this competitive type thing. Okay, but there's this sweet spot, right? There's this sweet spot that has to happen because Daimler-Chrysler never got to the sweet spot. It was just a mess up or whatever. But if you look at something like hip hop, you've got that understanding, the guys coming from the sort of neighborhoods and whatnot, they're competing, right? And they're trying to get the best work out there. And you talk about this in your book with the Wu-Tang Clan. But what's interesting too is you can go too far. And so the going too far becomes, something like the murders of Biggie and Tupac, right? I know about the murder. I know about the murders. I wasn't big fans of the music. I know some of the music, but it's interesting where, and even today, if you kind of look at it just on a basic male level, it used to be like, okay, if a couple males got into a fight, maybe there's a few punches, they learn something. Maybe they even become friends. Today, I don't know how many males want to fight today because you don't know if the 97-pound weakling isn't carrying a gun, is going to shoot you after. Everything, the whole notion of things has changed in such a way where some of that good competition, we really have to hunt for it and go look for it and make sure we set the playing field to find it. Otherwise, it might not happen.
I'm really glad you brought this up. With the Wu-Tang Clan, there's a crucial component that actually connects back to those hockey players. It's that Rizzo, when he put them together, he said, look, give me 5 years where this is about the family and everything is focused on Wu-Tang Clan being successful. Not you, but Wu-Tang Clan. Now, you're going to have to bring it to the competition. You're going to have to bring your lyrics and you're going to have to bring your thing in order to get on the track. But this is about Wu-Tang. And after 5 years, I'm going to make you each solo artist stars. And that's my promise. So that's the deal he made with them. Without that, I think it would have fallen apart much earlier. But what happened is Wu-Tang became number one. They became in this insane group. And then after 5 years, when they were number one on Billboard and they went platinum and all of this, he then started producing their individual albums. And that's when things got really dicey. And when they started to have fights about money, and they started to, they'd go long times without speaking to each other, and the group would fall apart. And they would come back together once in a while when they realized that, like, no, Wu-Tang is stronger than all of us individually. But that's when it fell apart. And there's this thing that you're getting at that I think is really important in society today, in business today, I think especially in politics today, is that the kinds of competition and conflict and friction and debate that actually move us forward are the kinds that are about ideas, not about destroying each other. You look at in hip hop when there were the East Coast West Coast rivalries, and then Biggie gets murdered and Tupac gets murdered. That became about more than just elevating the music. It wasn't about making that party better through the competition. It actually became about destroying the other people, and that's when things got violent. This happens a lot in politics inside of companies, right? When you care more about undermining that other person who's a jerk than you do about, the bottom line growing. And you see this, I think, especially in American politics today, where, we used to have and it's easy to kind of glamorize, the old days of when, Jefferson and Hamilton were debating and then coming up with a compromise. But we used to have much more of this gentlemanly thing where we would debate ideas and hopefully focus on the ideas and rather than just trying to destroy the political career of the other guy. And that's a lot of what happens on all sides, in politics. And you look at Facebook, people arguing about things in society and politics, and it's kind of the same thing. It's more about, beating that other person, making them look dumb, than it is about actually being willing to alter our viewpoint or trying to alter other people's viewpoints and actually make that happen. And how often do we see that in these kinds of debates? And I think that that's kind of a shame. And it's something that hopefully books like mine can remind us about the benefits of doing things the other way. But it's very hard because our ego gets into, becomes part of this, and that's where that individualistic kind of thing kind of comes back to bite us. But if we're really trying to push the game forward, we're really trying to make progress on, whatever it is that we're doing, then the goal can't be destroy the other guy. And I think that's where a lot of, in sports it can be very motivating to say, our goal in this game is to destroy that other hockey team. But if the goal is actually let's elevate the game of hockey to more of an art form, that becomes a much more interesting way to collaborate. And that means that your disagreements and your different styles that all come together and combine are more likely to add up to something more because you're doing this in service of the game, not in service of yourself. And I think that's the big problem that we have today in a lot of areas.
Yeah, you make a great point about that. I find myself these days that if I see anybody coming at me with a logical fallacy, or it could be just something as simple ad hominem, or you can tell that person is in full-blown cognitive dissonance, you almost just got to walk away because they just don't know that they're no longer having the honest debate of ideas. They're just looking for an angle. They just want to win. They just want to beat you. They want to destroy you. And they really don't care about the ideas anymore.
And that leads to that silence, which means none of y'all are making progress because when you're not talking, then it's not pushing forward. I actually have a personal story about this that I really like, of a time when I was humbled. The ad hominem thing brought it up. One time I wrote this article as a blog post that was kind of controversial, sort of a thought experiment. And I wrote this blog post, and months later, I get a text message from my PR person with a link to some Atlantic story that has my name in the URL. It's like Shane Snow, blah, blah, blah. And I wrote back, cool. And she wrote back, no, not cool. You should read it. And the story was basically this writer in the Atlantic, is an MIT professor, tearing apart this blog post of mine from a few months before, and using me as the example of what's wrong with X, Y, and Z in the world. And it was brutal. It was the most devastating critique I ever got. And a lot of it bothered me because it kind of did devolve into ad hominem. He was taking apart my argument, which fair. And then he said, and look at this guy, like what a chump, which not cool. And so I was really upset about this, like really upset. And The Atlantic is a very well-respected publication, and this was kind of an opinion piece, so it's his opinion and it is fine. But I was really upset about this. I ended up sort of sitting for a while in my anger and trying to calm down, and I ended up writing this guy a nice email, basically saying, agree to disagree on some of these points. Here's some of, some counterpoints to your points. But also I feel like, I just want you to know that I did not appreciate the ad hominem stuff. And he wrote back, I loved his response, and I kind of did this in sort of a way of, I want to make this guy feel bad. And he wrote back this great response where it was like, hey, you know what? I asked my editor to update the story to take out kind of the ad hominem stuff, because you're right, that's not fair. And also thank you for these points. And here's some more counterpoints, but also thank you for talking to me and not just, talking shit in the comments or on Twitter or whatever, not just attacking me, but thanks for starting this up. I would love to continue this conversation. And so we had this great back and forth, and he ended up inviting me to, if you ever want to come to one of my MIT classes and talk, with students, we can have like a debate like this. And I think this would be really useful for you to share your perspective. And it turned into this great thing. And in fact, later, on a couple of occasions when I had articles coming out that I was worried because they were similarly controversial, I actually emailed the guy and asked him, hey, I feel like you're probably going to hate this thing that I'm about to publish. Would you mind reading it first and telling me what you think is wrong with it so I can make it better? With pleasure. And in fact, would you read this piece of mine? And so we started this back and forth, and it feels so much better now that our, cognitive diversity, our conflict of ideas and the way of looking at things actually has turned into something that can elevate both of our work.
I give you props, but I don't think people out there listening should say, you know what, I'd like to emulate that MIT professor and use the ad hominem to perhaps, bring people in or something. It's just, It's not a great technique. It's not, No. It's pretty nasty, frankly.
Yeah, I think we both kind of learned a lesson that, right, like that part wasn't bad. And I told all my friends, I was like, this guy is a jerk and look at him and like, what a chump. I did the same thing, just not publicly. But I think that the nice moral of the story is that it turned out that we both realized that we could use our intellectual differences as a medium to make both of ourselves better. In general, as people, when you're working on something, you're trying to solve something, you're trying to do something better, don't ask your friends to critique it. Find your worst enemy and get them to critique it. And if they use ad hominem, try to separate that from the ideological critiques. But I think we need to do that more and more. You look at, in politics, and there's so much of this kind of name calling and tearing down the individual as a way to, to back up your argument. And we need to cut that out.
Well, we need to, but we might have to put a pin in that one because I don't know if it's going to happen anytime soon. It seems like America is in love with everything is a breaking news, lower third. The world is about to end. Go to your nuclear bunker right now. It's almost over every minute of the day. It's crazy. The book is Dream Teams Working Together Without Falling Apart. Great stuff, Shane. I really enjoy it. It's one of these things where you think, okay, this feels like stories and kind of an interesting read. And then if you've got any kind of business perspective or you're you're an entrepreneur, you're working for someone, whatever, all of a sudden you start to, hold on, this is kind of really bringing things in that I can use every day.
Well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. I had a lot of fun on this show talking about it. Thank you so much.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.